Supposher Sadiq Hussain here with another in the series of Affinity Photo tutorials highlighting the tools. So we've been going through the tools and we're now on the flood selection tool. In other software it's sometimes called the Magic Wand tool, the flood selection tool. Effectively it selects like-minded pixels, either that are touching or there are in somewhere else in the image. They're not touching, but they have the same value in color and luminosity. So it's all about selection process. Personally, I don't think it's as an effective tool as some of the others. I don't use it very often, but it's worth knowing what the peculiarities of it are. So this is a nice summer's day Wimbledon photograph. So on a cold winter's day, this is well worth editing this one. Before we actually do this tool, it's always a good idea to just sort of improve the contrast and the colors a little bit. And one of the quick ways of doing that, in fact, is just duplicating your layer and changing the blend mode from normal to overlay. Now overlay might be a little bit too strong, so bring it down to soft light. You can see that there's a subtle difference, and I think soft light is better. And then if you still think it's a bit too harsh, you can just bring the opacity of the layer down a little bit. So obviously if you take it back to 0, it's as the image was, but I think at about 80% is good. And if you then just disable that layer and say, well, that's the starting point and that's the end point, really does make a big difference to the image. It just boosts everything up, but without overly exaggerating the colors and the contrast. Okay, that aside, let's go back to the flood selection tools. Now, the context sensitive buttons at the top are obviously relevant to that tool, if you remember. So you got these modes here, which is new, so it's a new selection. Add, so you can add to it, which we'll use. Subtract, if you get something wrong and you want to subtract from the selection. And intersect, where selections need to intersect. Current layer or all layers. And the tolerance. Now the tolerance is key here, so you need to change it. Really, the higher the number, the more the selection is carefree about what it selects. Okay, and then contiguous, which is an unusual word. Contiguous basically means if it's touching or not. So if two pixels next to each other are of the same value, then they will be selected. If they are separated by other pixels, they will not be selected unless you turn contiguous off. So now if it's not contiguous, it means if there's a red pixel here and a red pixel down here, and you click on the one red pixel, as long as the value of the pixels is the same, they will both be selected. But I tend to find actually having it as set as contiguous, meaning that the only selects the pixels that are neighboring each other or touching, you can then add selection to it, and we'll demonstrate that with this little bit of color on the racket. Okay, so I've brought the tolerance down to about 10%, 9-10%, because it's a good starting point. Now before we do anything, I'm going to combine these two layers. Okay, so merge down just basically combines the two together, so that change that we made by having a duplicate layer, that boost is now baked in, if you like, into this layer. So we don't have to worry about, is this selection going to affect all layers or current layer? There is only one layer, so that's what it will affect. So, okay, so if I now click this red part here, you can see it's selected that, but not quite selected those pixels because they're slightly darker in nature. So you could increase the tolerance maybe if we just deselect, if we just increase the tolerance by a couple of percent and see what difference that makes. We click in the same place. Can you see now it's actually selected a little bit more? And I guess we could make that 13%, and it might just be right. I'll deselect it and I'll click in the same place, see what that does. That's about the same. So okay, so all I'm going to do now is click add to selection, zoom in, and just clicking that slightly different variation in color. Okay, that's a better selection of the red. If we're still on add to, and we want to add here, okay, that's selected that. I'm happy with that. And you could really fine tune it and say to select that as well. But for now, we just say that's what we want to select. Just those pixels. Go back to new selection, just so that you're back to base 1. Command and 0 or Control and 0 on a PC just to bring it back to full screen. And I'm happy with that selection. And of course, what do you want to do with it? You can refine the selection. You've got a refine option here, very similar to what we do when we use the other selection tools. Gives you a mask. You can change the border width, the smoothness, the feathering of the selection, and of course you can tell it which is a background, which is a foreground. Very similar to that, but we don't want to refine that now. And one of the things, of course, you could do once you've selected it, whichever tool that you use, is to do an adjustment. So if we say we want to do a HSL, a Hue Saturation Adjustment, and we could just change the hue of that part of the racket, yeah, or we could change the saturation, desaturate it a little bit, entirely up to you. But essentially, escape to deselected, that's the flood selection tool. Now, in my experience, the flood selection tool works particularly well if you've got one uniform color of an object, say for example a telephone box, or a letterbox, a mailbox, or a wash of color on a wall. Anything like that tends to work. Anything with shades to it isn't so well effective. There's far better ways, different ways, which we can explore with the other tools. Far better ways to use the selection tool. And in fact, this selection brush, which is what we used earlier, is far better than this one. But in certain instances, it works well. But in most, I think other selection tools are far better. Okay, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please leave a comment or a like. And of course, any suggestions on how you would use the flood selection tool, or how you have used it, would be welcomed as well. Put those in the comments. So thank you very much. Enjoy.